Morena, everyone. We're just letting everyone filter in for the moment. And once we have as many people as we can in the room, we'll get started. Just be a couple seconds or so. Okay, looks like the numbers are slowing down a bit. So, tēnā koutou katoa, ko Michael Dobbs toko ingoa. He kai whakamahire kau popa matua aho, I mahi ana aho ki iparengi Aotearoa. Now mai, haere mai. Good morning from Wellington, as my dogs play in the background. I am Michael Dobbs, a senior policy advisor at Internet New Zealand. And on behalf of me and my colleague James Ting Edwards, who will be speaking in a few moments, welcome to our presentation, Privacy and Online Identity, Exploring Algorithmic and Digital Identity. During the next 45 minutes or so, we'll be addressing two concepts related to online identity and privacy, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end as well. Be sure to enter those using the Q&A function in Zoom, and we'll get to as many as we can before we run out of time. I'll be starting off today with a brief look at algorithms and their role in the construction of one version of online identity, which is appropriately called algorithmic identity. Now, as I'm sure most of you already know, algorithms are computational processes that are often used to do things like make decisions. You might see them deployed as gatekeepers on online platforms, for example. Algorithmic gatekeeping is a process by which, according to the scholars Inept Tufekci, quote, algorithmic computational tools dynamically filter, highlight, suppress, or otherwise play an editorial role, end quote. So algorithms can be used to make decisions for us, but more importantly, they can also make decisions about us, determining information flows through online platforms and similar media. They can be used in human resources processes, such as deciding who to hire or who to fire, or to do things like flag potential terrorists or potential criminals. Cheney-Lippold argues that algorithmic processors are becoming opaque and buried, away from our individual vantage points and removed from most forms of critical participation. That opaqueness makes it hard for us as individuals to understand algorithms or to understand the influence they have over our experiences. It can also make them incredibly difficult to regulate. But perhaps because of their opacity, there are different conceptualizations of algorithms that are really common in public discourse. The scholar David Beer notes that one view of algorithms is a somewhat negative one, as a, quote, intermittent, shadowy, and powerful force, active in shaping social connections and relations, end quote. But somewhat contradictorily, he notes that algorithms are also trusted for their precision and objectivity. There is a persistent belief that algorithms can think more quickly, more comprehensively, and more accurately than we can as humans. As a result, things like search engine results or algorithmic recommendations are, in the words of Sophia Noble, naturalized as objective. Finally, Beer notes that algorithms are considered to be an authority. Algorithms do indeed give data purpose and direction. And Beer notes that the notion of the algorithm is evoked to do things like influence and convince, to suggest things, and to, in his words, envision a certain approach, governmentality, and way of ordering. Think how differently people might treat a top search result on Google, for example, from one found on page 4 of a Google search result. And that's assuming even you get to page 4 of a Google search result. But algorithms, again, also subject us as individuals, as users, to the exact same kind of governmentality, classification, and ordering that they subject data to. That process is aided, expanded, and made more systematic thanks to the collection of data via various platforms and interfaces, which can then be combined with data from other sources as well. One of the most recognizable examples of this is the use of data for online advertising. Cheney-Lippold discusses how platforms make use of user data to better understand how to more effectively target services, ads, and content. And he goes on to say that algorithmic regulation, quote, predicts our lives as users by tethering the potential for alternative futures to our previous actions as users, end quote. But Foytz, Fuller, and Stedler note that personalization or aggregation of data is, quote, about actively matching people to groups, that is, categorizing individuals, end quote. So algorithms, according to Beer, have the capacity to create, maintain, or cement norms and notions of normal versus abnormal. And the concept of normal or normality for Shirato et al. Is something that's both abstract and material. They argue that, that normal as a term is abstract because the concept of what is normal is often something arbitrary. But it's material because the definition of what is normal can have real-world effects. They use the example of calling someone overweight and argues that doing so influences how that person's body will be perceived and the significances and the meanings that are attached to that body. It could also change that person's actions, causing them to self-discipline in a way. So classification also influences our decisions. So according to Beer, because of this sort of Foucauldian nature of self-discipline, power is operationalized through things like algorithms. In that, in his words, the algorithmic output cements, maintains, or produces certain truths about the world. And that leads us to algorithmic identity. Now, all of the power dynamics that I've been discussing so far take place in what Hallinan and Streifus refer to as an emerging algorithmic culture, one that is defined by the use of computational processes to sort, classify, hierarchize people, places, objects, and ideas. And one outcome of this for Cheney-Lippold is that idea of what he calls a new algorithmic identity, which he defines as an identity formation that works through mathematical algorithms to infer categories of identity on otherwise anonymous beings. Algorithms use things that are called statistical commonality models to determine things like a person's gender or class, or even their race, in an automatic manner, at the same time as it defines the actual meaning of gender, class, or race themselves. As Cheney-Lippold says, ultimately, it moves the practice of identification into an entirely digital and thus measurable plane. In other words, algorithms define what certain characteristics mean. For example, what characteristics equate to masculine or feminine or Maori or Pakeha, and then measure our actions as individuals against those things and classify us based upon those models. So despite ideas like self-curation or self-branding, which are often associated with the way that we carefully craft our online identity on social media, for example, only posting attractive or good pictures of ourselves on Instagram, Cheney-Lippold argues that our identifications online are largely made for us through algorithms. And the result of this is a form of statistical stereotyping. What does it mean to be masculine or feminine or Maori or Pakeha is reduced to a set of measurable vectors that are all based upon certain stereotypes about each of those classifications. And of course, classifying users through these models can raise some significant privacy issues as well. Tufekci says that data plus computational power, in her words, now allow inferences about private information that may never have been disclosed to an online platform. Discussing a research project conducted on Facebook data, for example, she notes, and this is a fairly long quote here, apologies for that. For example, using only Facebook likes, a comparative tip of the iceberg in terms of data available on individuals. Researchers were able to fairly reliably model, that is, computationally and statistically guess to a high degree of accuracy, latent traits of 58,000 volunteers. The traits modeled, often with 80 to 90% accuracy, included sexual orientation, ethnicity, religious and political views, personality traits, intelligence, happiness, use of addictive substances, parental separation, age, and gender, among others. What this kind of data analysis can reveal about a person is not only far-reaching, it may include information that people themselves did not know and certainly did not intend to reveal, which again has significant implications for online privacy. And that study was conducted just by looking at Facebook likes. When you consider the other data people willingly share about themselves through various online platforms, and the way that data can be shared with or sold to data brokers who then aggregate data from multiple sources, the amount of information that can be inferred about our identity is compounded exponentially. Cheney-Lippold ultimately concludes that as a result of these algorithmic processes, we are effectively losing control in defining who we are online. But moreover, we're losing control over what information about us remains private. Moreover, whether accurate or not, that algorithmic identity has consequences, both online and offline. For example, an algorithmic identity can be used to discriminate, and that discrimination happens disproportionately against minority and marginalized groups in society. In her work, Sophia Noble discusses things like Google autocomplete suggestions, and she demonstrates how they tend to feature sexist or racist results. For example, she demonstrates how a search that began with the phrase "women need to" would be provided with autocomplete suggestions like be put in their places, know their place, be controlled, be disciplined. And a search that began with the phrase "why are Black people so" returned auto-completion suggestions such as loud, athletic, lazy, fast, tall, mean, funny, religious, ghetto, or rude. Now, a lot of these replicate stereotypes about women and racial groups, but they also impose identities upon those groups as well. And what Noble argues through her research is that each of these suggestions represents Google's algorithmic conceptualizations of a variety of people and ideas. And that's why we should care about algorithmic bias and algorithmic identity. Because our algorithmic identity can be used to determine what options are made available to us, how we are identified algorithmically is incredibly important. And of course, things like sexism and racism and other forms of discrimination play a role in other algorithmic determinations as well. And there are loads of examples of this. One incident or example involves a married couple that was applying for an Apple credit card. And despite the fact that this married couple provided the exact same information, Apple decided to give the husband, the man, a higher credit line than the one that they gave to his wife. Another somewhat well-known example is from Amazon, which began building an algorithm-powered employee review program in 2014 that would review job applicants' resumes to identify top talent. But very quickly, that algorithm started disregarding women for software developer jobs, ranking them lower than men, and other technical posts within the organization. And the reason for that is because the algorithm favored candidates who described themselves using verbs more commonly found on male engineers' resumes, such as executed or captured. In fact, it was so sexist that Amazon shut down this system in 2018. Now, these are just a couple of examples. Algorithms and algorithmic identity are, as I mentioned at the beginning, used to determine things like whether or not someone is a potential terrorist or a potential criminal. And again, the perceived objectivity and authority of algorithms naturalizes these decisions, makes them seem correct. But because algorithms act as gatekeepers based upon our algorithmic identity, they can, of course, affect our offline and offline experiences and options in incredibly significant ways. Despite these issues, there is increasing interest in learning about how our algorithmic identity can be used to shape personal beliefs, opinions, and even decision-making processes. In other words, how people can be nudged, technical term, to certain opinions or beliefs through things called opinion dynamics. So just to summarize really briefly, there are some issues with algorithmic identity, to put it quite mildly. Our algorithmic identity may include things like inferred private information that people didn't intend to reveal. It means, according to some scholars anyway, that people are increasingly losing control over their own identity definition on platforms. And algorithmic identity can reinforce stereotypes that lead to or exacerbate discrimination, particularly against minority, marginalized, and at-risk groups. Now, that kind of discrimination may cause some people to try to hide or disguise parts of their identity, which is not a desirable or a long-term solution. Instead, working to limit stereotypes and biases from being replicated in algorithmic processes is needed, but that is possibly a generational process and one complicated by the opaqueness of algorithms. But now, to discuss some other and perhaps better approaches to online identity, I'm going to pass to my colleague, James Ting Edwards, who is going to discuss digital identity.
Kia ora, Michael, and thank you for running the slides. Tēnā koutou katoa. So it's optimistic, isn't it? That if we've got all these problems with algorithmic identity where we have online services making inferences about us, maybe there's other ways of doing this that give people control over how they're represented, what their identity is, and who has access to that. So we've got a new piece of law in the Digital Identity Trust Framework, and I'm going to look at the process that led to that. So my engagement with digital identity for Internet NZ was around submitting on that bill. So we're going to ask an overall question: who does it work for? You can read that a couple of ways. We'll talk about what it is, what it can do, and what we might want to do about it. So next slide, please, Michael. So the gateway into digital identity is just thinking about what identity is, and a nice concrete way to think about that is your ID card, your driver's license or 18+ card or your passport, and there's a person who it's about. There's a person who's checking it, and that's the concrete way it might show up. So you might be buying a bottle of wine, and there's someone running a checkout who wants to know if you're over 18 and actually can access that legally. And then there's some back-end processes. So the vision of this kind of person-to-person relationship where you're handing over ID is facilitated by New Zealand Transport Agency issuing a driver's license, or Department of Internal Affairs issuing a passport, or someone else issuing an identity document that has a chain of trust behind it. Now, Michael has already spoken about some of these issues. When we think about cases like buying something at the supermarket, that feels nice and comfortable and benign. The people involved in that have lots of agency and choices. But ID, of course, can be used in other situations. So it can be used in law enforcement or an allocation of social welfare or healthcare. So just bear in mind some of those things and the prompts that we get reminded of. So if you go to the next slide, Michael, what's distinctive about digital ID? And the first thing is, instead of a name, it's got digital representations. I'm kind of flagging that with the zeros and ones. And instead of it being a static document that's capturing details about a person, it's quite hard to update a passport or a driver's license. We do it about every 10 years. It could be quite focused and targeted. And so it's who or what it's about. It could be a particular fact about someone, and who or what is checking, because it could be an automated system that is using the ID. And then the same thing, who or what makes it. And there's familiar examples. So at the time the Trust Framework Bill was going through, at the time the Select Committee was taking submissions, that was when we were in the midst of the peak public health response to the COVID pandemic. And we got the vaccine pass system activated on the same day as the closing date for those submissions, which I think meant that the people reading those submissions got a whole lot of worried responses about the nature of vaccine passes. It's also back to the space of things that feels kind of comfortable and benign. You might have an app from an airline that issues a digital marker that says, this is who you are, this is your status. Maybe you've been through passport control on their back end, and they can verify that to the airport. and get you through the processes there. So if we go to the next slide. One of the interesting comparisons, particularly coming from Internet NZ, is with domain names. So here's something that can be quite specific and targeted and interactive, used for lots of different things. It also presents a user-friendly front end. So you can search for it, or you can type in an intelligible, memorable name that's a lot easier to work with than an IP address, just a series of numbers that might change from time to time. And domain names are structured in a hierarchical way. So there's the root DNS server, and that's looking at the rightmost bit of the domain name, the top level, which in these cases both end in .nz. And so it goes to the .nz server, which is one of the things that Internet NZ runs, and says, we're looking for something .net.nz or privacy.org.nz. Where's the computer that hosts that? So there's a hierarchy of identifiers down the chain, and that's governed. There's ICANN, the Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, that runs the top level. And then there's organizations like Internet NZ that run the bits below that, and so on. Some of those are delegated. So there's particular groups in society who make decisions about how those are run. And then you get down to the level of emails. So you might have an organization that is saying this person gets this email. It's a way of showing how granular digital identity can be and how it can be carved up and used in automated ways. Next slide, please. So what are the features and bugs? There's a lot of discussion of digital identity in various terms. I've pulled out a couple of the ones that were salient to me, and that's that it's automated and it can be distributed. So automated means it can work without you thinking about it. So the dream of convenience is you have a smartphone or something with you that automatically on the back end tells your bank or the person you're shopping with the things they need to know about you. Because it's targeted, it can preserve privacy. It can be very convenient and fast, and you don't need to think about it. But if you're not thinking about it, then we're back a little bit into the world that Michael was describing with algorithmic identity. It means that you might be giving up some control if you don't have that direct visibility of how your ID is being used. And it's also distributed. So a whole lot of different organizations and people and systems can offer to verify facts about you or facts around the people you're dealing with. And so in a way that's democratized. You're not necessarily dependent on this centralized hierarchical chain of trust, but at the same time, does that create a risk of confusion? So we've got one passport authority, as long as that's well governed and trustworthy, and people are not trying to take advantage of it. Sometimes people do. We can rely on that chain of trust. When you have a broader range of people making claims, offering to verify claims, then how do you have that same level of trust in it? So if we go to the next slide, there's a couple of organizations that have done these amazing reports. So one is the Engine Room, which looks at digital IDs rooted in justice. This is their more recent one. And they did another one earlier that we drew on in our submission, looking at lived experience of people engaging with digital identity. And then there's Access Now, who has run the Why ID campaign. And I want to highlight these because thinking about the life situations that the people in this audience might encounter, we might go to the supermarket or the airline check-in, but ID and digital ID systems are also used around the world by governments and other institutions for all sorts of purposes. And the way that digital ID has been rolled out has tended to be centralized, sometimes mandatory, and this can worsen barriers to digital equity. So these are some of the points that Access Now make in their Why ID campaign. Some of the uses of it are in things like refugee camps, where people really don't have an alternative to adopting the ID system that gives them access to food, resources, shelter. And that creates some big problems for the narrative that digital ID is about giving people choice and control. You could wind up with some of the same considerations if it just becomes really ubiquitous. So if you, in principle, you have a choice, but if it's really easy for the organizations you interact with to verify claims, maybe that becomes more common. And it's a bit strange not to participate in that. And maybe even if you're used to being in those comfortable situations, you might start missing out on things as a result. The engine room have said in this latest report, digital ID systems act as de facto gatekeepers for marginalized communities, at times making it difficult for people to realize their rights. So that's a really key point, is that we've all got human rights in principle, but we often need things to activate them, and having a recognized identity and an ID that works with the local government systems might be one of those things. I say most of these systems are developed and implemented without civil society participation, and particularly without hearing from the communities most directly affected. And there are some worst case scenarios. So there was a biometric identity system in Afghanistan that when the Taliban took control, they got control over that system, and they had biometric information on a whole lot of people who had worked with US and other forces with the prior government. And those biometrics can't be revoked like you would revoke a password or a credit card number. In Bangladesh, data collected by the UN High Commissioner on Refugees from Rohingya refugees was shared with the Myanmar government. And it also didn't necessarily accurately classify people in terms of how they would identify. So here's this idea of digital identity as giving people choice, and in practice, it might give governments or institutions a lot of convenience and choice about the systems they operate. So this is why we need some robust governance to make sure that as we adopt the Aotearoa, it is not going in these directions. And so what we've got is the Digital Identity Trust Framework. If you go to the next slide, Michael. And this went through a policy process with the Department of Internal Affairs, and then a select committee process around the bill. And if you go advance the slide again, and the core features of this proposed were to create a trust board and a trust authority, to include expert input from Māori in the board, and to provide an opt-in framework for accrediting ID providers and services. And one of the main questions we had was around the opt-in nature of this framework, because if you think about other areas of business and life, financial services, for example, came to mind. We mandate a level of standards for people to participate in that market as a matter of consumer protection. So to have an opt-in framework seemed like it might create some risks. And so next slide. Internet NZ did a couple of things around this. One, we put up an explainer on what we thought the issues were and an invitation for other people to submit on it. And then in our own submission, we said that it was really important to get broader community input, that the officials and other organizations like Digital Identity NZ had done a really good job of engaging with the people they could reach, but that wasn't everyone who was going to be affected here. And we suggested some broader requirements for the expertise to help shape the system. So yes, requiring Māori expertise in particular, but also people who could speak to the user experience and human-centered design of systems that would have big implications for people, and also accessibility design. And finally, we suggested the idea of a trust framework. If we want digital identity systems to be trustworthy, then maybe it should be mandatory. Maybe there should be some level of a bar that you cross, that you would have to participate in the system rather than just doing it because you want accreditation for your particular business. Now, unfortunately, the only change to the legislation was, I think there were some changes around the way that Māori expertise would be included, but there was no specific requirement for any of these other considerations. And so if we go to the next slide, and this is where I'm going to wrap up. we've got this idea of a trust framework, and we've got this concept of trust that's really core to a lot of things in the digital policy environment. So we've got a digital strategy from the government, and the first pillar there is mahitika, so building trust with people. And there's a real divergence in how trust is talked about in business and technical communities that are enthusiastic about adopting technology. They tend to recognize that it's really important, and they talk about the trust within that system. And then there's people who are a little bit on the outside, so some civil society and community groups. And when they're talking about trust, they're coming from a place of, why would we trust the system that's been built without our participation? And so the reminder I'd like to put out as part of this conversation, and it ties in with the things Michael was speaking to around algorithms as well, is if we don't participate in it and have people we trust involved in building and monitoring it, why would we trust these systems? I've got a little kind of cartoon web there. And the final thought I'd like to finish my part of the talk here today with, before we do questions, and feel free to use the Q&A, is we've got some different language around the web. So you can have, instead of a hierarchical model, you can have a web of organizations and people going peer-to-peer saying, I know this person, I trust this person. And that's very organic, and it's the way that people interact. And that gives us a sense of control when we are the web. But you can also have a web that you get caught in, that other people and organizations control. And in that case, it doesn't feel like you are part of the web of trust. It feels like you're being subjected to it and stuck in it. And I really hope that we can do some things when we're designing regulations or when we're doing follow-up work around digital identity that will put us in the first position. So we are the web, we get to participate in it. So that's me. Thank you very much. I'm going to take a sip of water and hand back to Michael, and we'll look at the questions.
All right, kia ora, James. Thanks for that. James and I both tend to be verbose, and I think we erred on the side of caution this time around, but that means we have plenty of time for questions and answers. And I see there are just a couple in the queue already, so I'll just start there. Karen notes that the sales point for all of these services is convenience. Yeah, absolutely. What is often overlooked is that when ownership or responsibility changes, for example, Twitter, what people have agreed to can change without their control, or that they have already given away. And the Afghanistan example was perfect for that. So the question that she has is, how do people regain control over things they may have already given away? James, do you want to start with that one, or?
Yeah, sure. So I really like, thanks, Karen, the Twitter example. And it's a really good example because it's one of those things that people who are very digitally engaged and connected and empowered are still subject to some of these changes. So you can have shared a whole lot of information historically with a platform, and it changes ownership and its governance changes. It stops enforcing hate speech and other policies, and it becomes a different place, and your information is already out there. So the question is, how do we regain control? Well, there's a very sad sense in which we can't. So it's worth taking some precautions around sharing that information in the first place. And I'm absolutely not just saying that in terms of individuals taking precautions, like the normal cybersecurity guidance, but structurally, how do we take precautions around systems getting into that state? And that might require some level of regulation. So we have data protection and privacy law. In principle, we have competition law, but we need to keep monitoring and working on these things. There's some frameworks, like there's a code of practice for online services, but Internet NZ and other civil society organizations have had some real questions around how robustly that's going to maintain standards for online services. So there's a lot of work to be done, and let's hope that work can continue.
Yeah, wholeheartedly agreed. To the first point, yes, convenience is always the selling point. And in a previous life, I was a university lecturer. And I remember, this was when I was back in Canada, one of my students saying one day, "Oh, thank goodness Facebook gives me ads so I know what shoes to buy." And I remember not being able to speak for a few seconds because I was shocked by the absurdity of that statement, at least from my perspective. Because, I was thinking of all the things that she gave up in order to be sold a specific pair of shoes and that she was so willingly going to buy them. But the assumption that what she was being recommended was a convenience and was a sort of objective evaluation of what she should buy. But in terms of how we regain control over our data and what we've given away, James is absolutely right. At present, we don't necessarily have the frameworks in place to allow for that. So what might be needed is more regulation. And if any of you happen to see Linnell Tafari-Huria's presentation yesterday on Maori data sovereignty, she pointed to some things that could be done in order to achieve that. So she talked about principles of Maori data sovereignty, things like whanaungatanga, manakitanga, kaitiakatanga. So things like balancing rights and accountabilities, respect, free and prior informed consent about giving data, data ethics and restrictions, all of which could be incorporated into some sort of regulatory framework to allow people to have more control over data once they've given it, or to have more choice in what data they do give over. And one of the reasons why I really appreciated her contribution is that it shows just how important it is to have a Te Tiriti-centric perspective in regulation, because those things wouldn't help just Maori, they would help everyone. And while giving Maori data and Maori data sovereignty the respect that it deserves as well. So these are things that need to be incorporated. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, you have an opportunity to do more, but we'll move on for now. The next question is from Khalid. It's definitely for you, James, because it begins with a bit of a philosophical point. Since the Second World War, philosophy has robustly criticized representational knowledge, of which surely digital identity is a subgroup of. Should we be applying some of those philosophical analyses to these so-called new forms of identity production to show their shortcomings and their risks?
So I'll say sure. And while I have some background in very analytic philosophy academically, I'm not going to pretend to be across the line of argument that Khalid's pointed out there. The bit that has interested me is kind of who gets agency and the contrast between the claims that are made for digital identity and maybe the way that it does actually operate. It does provide convenience for a lot of people in a lot of situations, but also the risks that we're buying into. And I'll take the chance because you've mentioned philosophy in the broader sense, so I'll just crowbar this in here as well. Michael talked in his portion of the discussion today around how people will treat algorithmic systems as both opaque and mysterious and authoritative. And I think that is almost certainly the case with digital identity systems as well. And you don't have so much of that contrast. People will just trust the identity system given the narrative that it is about giving people choice and there's consent, and that it is it's convenient and accurate and you can check the data and all those things. And a lot of the time that's reasonable, but you want to know on the back end that you actually can check those things are all true if you're relying on it at that level in the moment to make decisions that you're not reflecting on too much. So I think that's as far as I can take that. But if you want to advance the philosophical arguments about representational knowledge, then by all means go for it.
Yes, don't have anything to add to that one. So thanks, James. James has a philosophy background. I played video games. All right. Next question is from Lisa, who asks, what can be or is being done to reduce algorithmic bias and discrimination, given the significant implications of this bias and discrimination? Who is responsible for this? And what can we do as online users to reduce the impact of this algorithmic bias? I will start with this one because what can be done is something that James has already pointed to and I've already pointed to as well. Get people from affected groups involved in the design process of algorithms from the beginning. So algorithms are used in all sorts of systems, everything from facial recognition to, like I said, determining whether or not someone is likely to be a criminal. And because minority groups, for example, people with darker skin, weren't involved in the design process of some facial recognition systems and algorithms, those systems simply don't recognize people with darker skin. So if you involve people in the process, not just test on them, but involve them in the development process itself, then you're much more likely to have, there's less of a chance that bias will creep in. And of course, that bias comes from designers, right? So ultimately, yes, code is math, and so ostensibly objective, even that's a problematic statement, but algorithms are definitely not, because they're engineered by humans. Who is responsible? Designers, platforms that use them, governments that choose to regulate them or not. And then what can users do? Like I said, it's really difficult right now. There's, and for some people, there's probably a desire, a reaction to hide parts of your identity, which is not a healthy way to go about things by any stretch of the imagination. So the shorter answer is there's not much except raise awareness of these issues, lobby those who are designing platforms and systems to increase their community participation, and then just be aware of how much data you give out and whether or not you want to share what you're sharing. James, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, just a little bit. One thing that is a kind of a distinctive problem in a smaller place like Aotearoa is a lot of these systems are designed internationally for international markets and international populations, and their training data reflects the places they're developed, the people who develop them, and not necessarily the people who live here or who they're going to impact here. So it's only a line of research, but one line of research that I've been interested in is the idea of having some data that is more representative of people here to validate models. And so you can look at the age structure, and a place that's in the South Pacific that maybe has more representation of Polynesian and Asian peoples than elsewhere in the world, and test, is this model that claims to be making authoritative claims, is it actually going to work? Just the first sniff test. So obviously the better thing is to get people actively participating, but maybe there's some quick, cheap ways to test the validity if you're going to bring a model from overseas and apply it here. And so that's something that I think we could do, that government and others who take a lead on accessibility and could take a lead on UX design could build into the processes where we're adopting these technologies. Michael's been doing a lot of work asking the question, so I'll grab the next one from Eduardo Orlando. Do you feel that algorithmic identity is inherently not private? More and more I'm finding the simplest way of ensuring my information isn't abused is by not giving it. There seems to be a financial incentive to gather and use as much information as possible, and it seems regulators aren't engaging with privacy concerns submitted to them. Michael, do you want to take that?
Yeah, algorithmic identity is increasingly not private, simply because, as I suggested in the presentation, so much of your identity can be inferred with surprising accuracy, even if you try really hard not to reveal any information. And so, as you say, a lot of people find that the simplest way of ensuring that your data isn't abused is just by not giving it, which is also difficult to do. There are a number of systems that require you to give data in order to access whatever it is you're trying to access. Social media get a lot of abuse, but government systems, online shopping, these are all things where you need to give at least a modicum of data in order for that system to work properly. And yes, there seems to be a financial incentive to gather and use as much data as possible. So this is a political economic argument, and I won't bore people by going into political economy too much, but the basic financial model of pretty much any online platform, particularly social media, where we tend to give a lot of our information, is to, and a lot of our interaction, is to collect as much data as possible, package it with other data, sell it to advertisers, so that the users of online platforms are the actual product, not the platforms or the ads or the products being advertised through those online ads. I mean, this is the same model that broadcast television has used for the last 7 decades or more, and commercial radio before that. The audience is always the commodity that is being bought and sold. It's just the way it works. And so this is something that regulators have looked at with those legacy media, those traditional media. And one of the issues with online media is that they develop so rapidly and so fast that regulators struggle to keep up in certain situations. But privacy concerns do need to be included in any consideration of data sovereignty and data rights, but also things like online advertising as well. And that's why we have a privacy office and a privacy commissioner who are looking at these things. James.
Yeah, I'll roll with that a little bit. So I've also seen people arguing credibly that there's some statistical problems with the way that this is done. So it seems like a lot of the gathering and use of data is done just because it's technically feasible. And some of the time, you don't get that much benefit from the extra granularity of information about people and their behavior. And certainly, if you were doing a cost-benefit comparison of like, do we really need to track this person's movement throughout every moment of the day, versus the, to target advertising to them versus the benefit, even from a business's, the harm of that has on that person's privacy and broader society. Even from a business perspective, even from a statistical perspective, sometimes it might not make sense. And I would compare it to lighting. So lighting has got radically cheaper, and the response to that has not been that we go, okay, we're going to have the same amount of lighting at much less cost. We're making our spaces much brighter. I think the same thing is happening with CCTV cameras in terms of the level of surveillance of visual surveillance of space by digital systems. It's so much cheaper that people are rolling this out. And I think that leads into Eduardo's follow-up question, which is, do you think we're at the stage where we need a proper full GDPR? A few years ago for Internet NZ, I was involved in a submission process on privacy reform, and we suggested in that process that we should require a review of New Zealand's framework for privacy. One reason for that was to make sure that we maintain adequacy status with the European Union, so we don't have to jump through specific hoops on specific occasions to get EU data shared here. So that seems like a good idea, but I'm going to say that that seems like one for the team at the Privacy Commissioner, and in a coincidence, I'm shortly going to be joining that team in a week and a half. So we'll figure it out. But it is definitely true that the I should say I'm going to be learning mostly for the first little while at least. It is definitely true that the GDPR, because of the size of Europe and the size of the fines, has driven a lot of change, not just in Europe, but around the world in how digital systems are governed. And so it shows that the right kind of scale of regulatory response does drive change in how these systems are developed and adopted and used.
Yes, certainly something to consider. And I don't mean to be negative all the time, but there are some issues with the GDPR as well. So you need to look at some of the design that goes into protecting privacy. One of the outcomes of the GDPR is the constant pop-ups that you get visiting websites about which cookies you would like to accept and which ones you wouldn't, which some people find so laborious that they just go with, yeah, whatever. And so they can get to their website, which is giving up their privacy. But also some of the fines that are involved coming out of the GDPR aren't always quite as prohibitive as regulators would assume. So one example is that Facebook, after pretty sure it was after Cambridge Analytica, was fined $5 billion by the US government for violating users' privacy rights. And after that decision came out, Facebook's stock price jumped. So Facebook gained over $5 billion in value because a $5 billion fine, US dollar fine, was seen as not that big a deal for Facebook.
Yeah, less than expected. I don't necessarily like to correct people on privacy stuff, but this feels like the space. I think the cookie notices are the e-privacy directive, which is an
yes, you are
older
correct.
thing. And it's up for review because people are sufficiently annoyed about the cookie notices.
Thanks. You're absolutely right.
Karen asked, do you think regulation should include the ability to take your content back? And Elizabeth Kim has asked, do you mean like a right to be forgotten, which we don't have in the law here in Aotearoa, but it does exist in EU. Actually, initially from court decisions, I think there. And I think there's some really interesting information governance questions around revoking consent, giving consent and revoking consent for the use of information. It's one of the problems with regulatory responses to online services when you are part of a network of people sharing information. Your decisions aren't just about you, they also affect other people. And so you can consent to sharing of data, and in effect, you're doing so on behalf of other people. But one space where this kind of issue of restricting access to content online has played out is in copyright policy, and that continues to be a big issue online. And it's very, very hard to intervene in a proportionate way that preserves access. I think some of the issues there are clearer when you're talking about personal information. Like it is more clear that a person has ongoing interests in restricting access to information about them. But it's a really hard space, and because of the interactive nature of not necessarily just the online services, but the way that you and your friends and your family are using them, there's a lot to work through. But it's a good question. Michael, do you want to say anything specific on that?
Well, I mean, anything, you've covered all the basics and not so basics, but any sort of system that gives people more control over their data portability, that would all be welcome from my personal perspective, and should absolutely be considered as part of regulation, right? That any data that's generated, any content you create, should be yours. Now, of course, all the devil is in the details of terms and conditions and that sort of thing, but who actually reads the terms and conditions? There are studies that show that some of them, for major platforms that we use, take quite literally hours to go through and read. And of course, the legal expertise needed to parse all the information in there about what happens with your data are opaque to most people, myself included. So I would absolutely like to see regulation that addresses how much control individual users have over not just the content, but the data that they supply, whether actively or behind the scenes.
There was another question from Elizabeth that I'm going to pick up. So firstly, there's a shout out to you, Michael. Tinakwe, as an ex-student, it's nice to watch another presentation.
Really sorry, Elizabeth, really sorry.
Do you think that there are realistic and practical benefits for a mandatory digital identity system that can be used to enhance access to social services, healthcare, whatever else for more marginalized diaspora in the community? If so, what do you think they are, or have most studies focused on how it can worsen barriers? And so that's about digital identity, so I'll take that in the first instance. I think there's a mix, and I focus on trust as the key enabler. So has the work been done to build trust so that people will engage with the system? So it can enhance access, it can create barriers. So remembering that a lot of people don't have smartphones or aren't sophisticated and confident users of them. And this was an issue around the rollout of the digital vaccine passes. So there's a lot of people for whom that's okay, but if you're making it a condition of entry into spaces that people need for the basics of life, you really need it to be usable for people who might find it easier to keep track of a piece of paper. And I think there was provision for that. So you really need to do the kind of UX and accessibility and human rights and gender and utility and all those analyses if you're saying this is going to be for everyone, the idea, I will say one of the spaces of potential benefit from digital identity is we are hearing, and there's been lots of sessions in Privacy Week around generative models for producing text. And so there's machines that are going to be really good and are now really good at claiming to be someone, adopting that person's voice as they write, or literally in terms of the sound of someone's voice. And one of the things that digital identity systems could potentially help with is providing a good way to verify this is really me. This is really a system acting on my behalf. But as we look to adopt systems to, for their own benefits and to respond to these other concerns, we really need to be sure that they are working in the interests of everyone, not just the narrow group of people who've been involved in building them. Michael, do you want to say anything specific about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely correct. All around, it's a fine balance. And I don't think that most, and certainly not all studies, have focused just on how these kinds of systems are worse for certain people. There's definitely an effort to make sure that technologies like algorithms and digital identity systems are leveraged to support these groups. But there is a balance, as James suggested, right? You want to make sure you build systems that are useful and helpful for everyone, but you don't want to do so in a way that violates the basic human rights of those individuals involved, or increases the opportunity for misuse of that data, violating their privacy and that sort of thing.
And so just flagging that we are coming up on time and we already have loads of fantastic questions. So unfortunately, we're not going to get to all of them in the remainder of this session. One that I'd like to roll with is from Joe Standen. It says a recent Digital Identity New Zealand survey indicates both businesses and consumers have low levels of trust and awareness around identity information management. The business community indicates a general desire to improve this, but it seems the communication of the potential value of the trust framework is blurred. How might any value be more clearly highlighted in order that a wide range of organizations invest accordingly? Michael, do you want to kick off a response to this?
No, I'm going to reread it.
So how might any value be more clearly highlighted? I think I focused in my presentation on the civil society and kind of human rights and governance concerns around digital identity. And one of the reasons for that is because in my engagement with it, I saw that being a space that was less well represented. There has been a lot of discussion around the potential value, and organizations like banks and airlines and government agencies, it could be very convenient for them to issue and rely on digital identity markers rather than having to always check physical identity markers. That could speed up a lot of transactions. That would have a lot of benefit to people interacting with these services, but it also does involve a handover of control. So I think the building trust and showing value go hand in hand. It's like a banking system. You really want to know that you're being looked after and it's not going to act adverse to your interests. So even from a business perspective, I think it's a really important lens.
Yes, thanks, James, for stalling for me by giving a important and coherent answer. But this is one of the questions that highlights the importance and value of transparency on behalf of all parties, but particularly those that are controlling the data and using the data. So if those organizations, those entities that are collecting data were more transparent in plain language about what they do with that data, what data they store, how they intend to use it, how long it will be kept, so on and so forth, then that's the beginning steps to building that kind of trust that James was talking about. So transparency needs to be part of any organization's data policy and data privacy policy.
Okay, and we are at time. So thank you so much, Michael, for kicking us off. Thank you to everyone for watching and for the great questions that we've had in the Q&A. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to them all, but have really enjoyed the chance to be here chatting with you.
Yes, nā mihi, everyone. Thank you very much. Our contact information is there. I'm sure James's email address will work for another 10 days or so. Please feel free to contact us if you have any questions, but otherwise I hope you have a great now afternoon. Kakite.